Hello everyone. In today's video we are going to be looking at chapter 20. We're going to be looking at the lymphatic system and a little bit at lymphatic organs and tissues. So a lymphatic system consists of a fluid that's called lymph, and we have vessels that are called lymphatic vessels that transport that lymph. And there are a number of structures and organs containing lymphatic tissue. So lymphatic tissue, this is lymphocytes within a filtering tissue. And within the lymphatic system, we also do have red bone marrow. The lymphatic system assists in circulating body fluids and also helps to defend the body against disease-causing agents. Most components of blood plasma will filter through blood capillary walls to form interstitial fluid. We know this already, but where does that interstitial fluid go as well? After blood plasma passes through the capillaries into interstitial spaces, and it's called interstitial fluid, then interstitial fluid will pass into lymphatic vessels, and after it's in the lymphatic vessels, we call it lymph. The major difference between interstitial fluid and lymph is really just location, where interstitial fluid is found between cells, and lymph is located within lymphatic vessels and lymphatic tissue. So lymphatic tissue is a specialized form of reticular connective tissue that contains large numbers of lymphocytes. Here on this picture on the left, we can see all these principal components of the lymphatic system. We can see these lymphatic ducts, large components of the lymphatic system, including the spleen, red bone marrow, and then a lot of nodes that we can see around here. And we'll talk about those nodes yet too. Now I said that lymphatic tissue is this connective tissue that contains large numbers of lymphocytes. Now there are two types of lymphocytes that participate in this adaptive immune response. These are going to be B cells and T cells. The lymphatic system has three primary functions. The first one is that it drains excess interstitial fluid. So lymphatic vessels will drain excess interstitial fluid from tissue spaces and return it to the blood. This function really closely links it with the cardiovascular system. In fact, without this function, the maintenance of circulating blood volume would really not be possible. The second function is that it transports dietary lipids. So lymphatic vessels will transport lipids and lipid-soluble vitamins. So these are going to be vitamin A, D, E, and K, which are absorbed by the gastrointestinal tract. So that's A, D, E, and K. And then our final primary function, one that we'll actually talk about quite a bit, is that the lymphatic system carries out immune responses. So lymphatic tissue initiates very highly specific responses directed against particular microbes or abnormal cells. Lymphatic vessels begin as lymphatic capillaries. These capillaries, which are located in the spaces between cells, are closed at one end. Now, just as blood capillaries converge to form venules and then veins, lymphatic capillaries unite to form larger lymphatic vessels, which kind of resemble small veins in structure, but they have thinner walls and even more valves. So lymphatic vessels have a lot more valves. At intervals along lymphatic vessels, lymph will actually flow through lymph nodes. Lymph nodes, these are encapsulated, kind of bean-shaped organs that consist of masses of B cells and T cells. Now, in your skin, lymphatic vessels lie in the subcutaneous tissue, and generally they do follow the same routes as veins. Lymphatic vessels that are found in the viscera or around the organs, these are deep to the skin, right? And so they generally will follow the routes of arteries and form plexus networks around these arteries. So here we can see a lymphatic capillary on the right. We can also see that relationship of the lymphatic capillaries to the blood capillaries and also to the tissue cells around them. We can see that they have this dead end here because it ends here. We can also see this dead end here. So it's not a continuous system. They do have kind of dead end capillaries. Now, some differences that we have between lymphatic capillaries and blood capillaries is that lymphatic capillaries have a greater permeability than blood capillaries, and so they can absorb large molecules like proteins and lipids. So higher permeability. This is a greater permeability than the blood capillaries. Lymphatic capillaries are also slightly larger than blood capillaries, so larger diameter. And they also have this unique one-way structure that allows interstitial fluid to flow into them, but not out. So we can see these black arrows here in this right picture. This is going to be that one-way flow of the interstitial fluid into the lymphatic capillary and then to become lymph. So when the pressure is greater in the interstitial fluid than in lymph, the cells of the lymphatic capillary will separate slightly. So we can see the separation a little bit. And it's kind of like the opening of a one-way swinging door. And in this way, the interstitial fluid will enter the lymphatic capillary. But when the pressure is greater inside the lymphatic capillary, the cells will adhere or stick more closely together so that the lymph cannot escape back into the interstitial fluid. Attached to the lymphatic capillaries are anchoring filaments. So these little green bits here sticking out from the lymphatic capillary here. These are anchoring filaments which contain elastic fibers. Now they'll extend out from the lymphatic capillary, attaching the lymphatic endothelial cells to the surrounding tissues. So it kind of just anchors it in place. Lymph passes from lymphatic capillaries into lymphatic vessels and then through lymphatic nodes. As lymphatic vessels exit lymph nodes in a particular region of the body, they will unite to form lymph trunks. The principal trunks are the lumbar, intestinal, bronchomediastinal, subclavian, and jugular trunks. Lymph passes from lymph trunks into two main channels, either the thoracic duct or the right lymphatic duct, and then it will drain into venous blood. The lumbar trunks, these will drain lymph from the lower limbs, the wall and viscera of the pelvis, the kidneys, the adrenal glands, and the abdominal wall. The intestinal trunk, this drains lymph from the stomach, intestines, pancreas, spleen, and part of the liver. The bronchomediastinal trunk, this drains lymph from the thoracic wall, lung, and heart. The subclavian trunks drain the upper limbs. And then the jugular trunks will drain the head and the neck. This picture on the right here, we can see the areas that are drained by the right lymphatic or the thoracic duct. So remember that lymph will pass from lymph trunks into these two main channels, the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. And so the right lymphatic duct will drain actually a much smaller portion of the body than the thoracic duct. You can see this yellow-orange color is going to be the area drained by the right lymphatic duct. Just the right arm and the right half of the head and chest, right down to about the diaphragm, just inferior to the ribs. And then the whole rest of the body is drained by the thoracic duct. Now the thoracic duct, which is going to be this one labeled here, the right of our picture, but it's on the left of the body. And this thoracic duct is the main duct for return of lymph to blood. The thoracic duct receives lymph from the right and left lumbar trunks. Which isn't denoted on this picture. It also gets lymph from the left jugular trunk, from the left subclavian trunk, and the left bronchomediastinal trunks. We'll also kind of add on here the right and left lumbar trunks. So what we're going to see is that the thoracic duct receives lymph from the left side of the head, neck, and chest, the left upper limb, and the entire body inferior to the ribs. Kind of like we saw in that last picture. The thoracic duct in turn is going to drain lymph into venous blood at the junction of the left internal jugular vein and the left subclavian vein. So right here at this junction of those two veins is where the thoracic duct is going to drain its lymph into the blood. On the other side, we see the right lymphatic duct. This duct is going to receive lymph from the right jugular trunk, the right subclavian trunk, and the right bronchomediastinal trunk. Thus, the right lymphatic duct receives lymph from the right, or the upper right side of the body, we could say. Now, from the right lymphatic duct, lymph is going to drain into venous blood at the junction of the right internal jugular vein and the right subclavian vein. So again, right here at that junction, that right lymphatic duct is going to drain lymph back into the blood. Most components of blood plasma, such as nutrients, gases, and hormones, will filter freely through the capillary walls to form interstitial fluid. But more fluid filters out of the blood capillaries than returns to them by reabsorption. Because most plasma proteins are too large to leave blood vessels, interstitial fluid really only contains a small amount of protein. Proteins that do leave blood plasma cannot return to the blood by diffusion, and this is because the concentration gradient opposes this movement. So there's a much higher level of proteins inside blood capillaries and a low level outside. So in order to move back into the blood, these proteins would have to move against their concentration gradient. Now, like veins, lymphatic vessels contain valves, and this ensures that one-way movement of lymph. As I said previously, lymph drains into venous blood through the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct at the junction of the internal and subclavian veins. So here we just kind of have that representation of those lymphatic ducts, both of them, emptying into the junction of the subclavian and jugular veins, bringing that fluid back to the cardiovascular system. So here on the left, we have that sequence of fluid flow. So it's going to be blood capillaries. Here we call the fluid blood. That's going to move into the interstitial spaces, where we now call it interstitial fluid, and then into lymphatic capillaries, which we now call it lymph, into the lymphatic vessels, then into lymphatic trunks, and then into those lymphatic ducts. And then into the junction of the internal jugular and subclavian veins, which we now call it blood. So it's also very important to note that the same two pumps that aid in venous blood to return to the heart will also help to maintain the flow of lymph. So remember, these are the skeletal muscle pump, and also the respiratory pump. So those are going to be the two pumps that will kind of go against gravity and help to bring blood and also lymph fluid back to the heart from areas far away from the heart. The widely distributed lymphatic organs and tissues are classified into two groups based on their functions. These are the primary lymphatic organs. These are going to be the sites where stem cells divide and become immunocompetent. So immunocompetent essentially means that they are capable of mounting an immune response. Now the primary lymphatic organs are red bone marrow and the thymus. Now the second classification group is going to be secondary lymphatic organs, and we will discuss those just a little bit later. So of the two primary lymphatic organs, we're really just going to discuss the thymus. We're not going to talk too much about the red bone marrow, but mostly just the thymus. So the thymus here, this is a bilobed organ, meaning it has two lobes, and it's located in the mediastinum between the sternum and the aorta. Now there's a layer of connective tissue that encapsulates the entire organ, and it holds those two lobes close to one another. But there's also a connective tissue capsule that separates the two lobes. Now, extensions of the capsule, which are called trabeculae, will penetrate inward and divide each lobe into lobules. So here, I'll write this a little bit better here. So these are trabeculae. These will penetrate into the lobes and divide each lobe into lobules. So here in this picture on the left, we can see these thymic lobules. We can see the trabeculae that separate or also invaginate from the capsule and separate the lobe into these lobules. Now each lobule consists of a deeply staining outer cortex and a lighter staining central medulla. Now the cortex, this is composed of a large number of T cells, scattered dendritic cells, epithelial cells. These are specialized epithelial cells. And macrophages. Now, immature T cells, these are also known as pre-T cells. These are made in the red bone marrow, and they're going to migrate from the red bone marrow into the cortex of the thymus, where they proliferate and they begin to mature. So this is in the cortex that they proliferate and begin to mature. Then we have dendritic cells. These are going to be derived from monocytes, but they assist in the maturation process of these T cells. So assist the T cells in maturation. Now, each of these specialized epithelial cells in the cortex have several long processes that surround the T cells and serve as a framework for as many as 50 T cells. So lots of processes, or these sticky out bits from the cells, that act as a framework. Now, these epithelial cells will essentially help to educate the pre-T cells in this process known as positive selection. So positive selection is a process we'll go over in a little while. These epithelial cells will also produce thymic hormones that also aid in the maturation of T cells. Now, really, only about 2% of developing T cells survive in the cortex. So they're only about 2% are going to kind of pass this selection process. The remaining cells that don't pass the selection process, they're going to die by apoptosis. So remember, this is programmed cell death. So because we have like 98% of these pre-T cells that go through apoptosis, we kind of need something to clean all them up. So that's where these macrophages come in. So macrophages help to clear out the debris of the dead and dying cells. Now, these surviving T cells will go from the cortex into the medulla. Remember, it's only about 2% of these T cells. So these are going to be the surviving T cells that survive this positive selection process. Now, the medulla, this consists of widely scattered, more mature T cells, but we're also going to see dendritic cells and epithelial cells and macrophages still in the medulla as well. Now, once these T cells are pretty mature, they're able to leave the thymus by the blood and migrate to lymph nodes, like the spleen, or lymph nodes that there's going to be multiple places they migrate to, lymph nodes, the spleen, and other lymphatic tissues. And this is where they're going to be put to work in the immune system if they are needed. So from the medulla, they're going to migrate to the blood, where they will then go to lymph nodes, to the spleen, and also to some other lymphatic tissues, where essentially they're kind of complete the job that they've been training for their whole lives. Then we have secondary lymphatic organs and tissues, and these are the sites where most of the immune responses occur. So we know that primary lymphatic organs are where the stem cells divide and become immunocompetent, and then the secondary lymphatic organs are where most immune responses occur. So they're going to include lymph nodes, the spleen, and lymphatic nodules, also called lymphatic follicles. Now the thymus, the lymph nodes, and the spleen are considered organs because each of them is surrounded by a connective tissue capsule. Whereas the lymphatic nodules are not considered organs because they lack a capsule. So these lymphatic nodules are more considered to be lymphatic tissues, not lymphatic organs. Now, located along lymphatic vessels are about 600 of these bean-shaped lymph nodes. Now, they are scattered throughout the body, both superficially and deep, and they usually occur in groups. Now, large groups of lymph nodes are present near the mammary glands, in the axillae, and in the groin. So this is where we're going to see the largest groups of lymph nodes found. So here on the left, we do have a lymph node. And lymph nodes, just like the thymus, are covered by a capsule. This is going to be a capsule of dense connective tissue that extends into the node, separating it into separate compartments, just like we saw with the thymus. These capsular extensions, just like in the thymus, are called trabeculae, just like those bony extensions also that we see in spongy bone. And the trabeculae of a lymph node is going to divide the node into compartments. It'll also provide support, and it'll also provide a route for blood vessels into the interior of the node. Now, the functional part of a lymph node is divided into a superficial cortex, or an outer cortex, and a deep medulla. So the cortex actually consists of an outer cortex and an inner cortex, kind of two different parts of the cortex. Now, within the outer cortex, we have egg-shaped aggregates of B cells called lymphatic nodules. Aggregates or collections of B cells. Now, a lymphatic nodule consisting mainly of B cells is called a primary lymphatic nodule. So if it has mostly B cells, it'll be a primary lymphatic nodule. But most lymphatic nodules in the outer cortex are going to be secondary lymphatic nodules. And secondary lymphatic nodules, these form in response to an antigen or foreign substance. And these are sites of plasma cell and memory B cell formation. So secondary lymphatic nodules will form in response to an antigen. And this is where we get plasma cells and memory B cells. And again, we'll talk about these specific types of cells a little bit later, but this is where we get these types of cells in these secondary lymphatic nodules. So most of the time, the outer cortex is going to have these primary lymphatic nodules until we have a foreign substance come in. And when a foreign substance, also known as an antigen, comes in, then these will immediately turn into secondary lymphatic nodules in order to fight off this antigen, in order to combat the antigen. Now, within the center of a secondary lymphatic nodule, there's going to be this region of light staining cells, which is called a germinal center. So you can see one's labeled actually right here, germinal center in the secondary lymphatic nodule. Now, within the germinal center, we have B cells, we have follicular dendritic cells, follicular dendritic cells are a specific or a special type of dendritic cells. And then we also see macrophages there in that germinal center as well. So here on this picture on the left, we can see these cells in the germinal center of the outer cortex, the B cells, follicular dendritic cells, and macrophages. Cells around that germinal center, mostly going to be B cells. A little bit deeper in the inner cortex, we're going to see some T cells and then more dendritic cells. And then in the center of a lymph node in the medulla, we're going to have B cells and then plasma cells and macrophages. So the inner cortex does not contain lymphatic nodules. It's mostly going to consist of T cells and dendritic cells that enter a lymph node from other tissues. In that inner cortex. Then, like we saw in the picture on the other slide, the medulla of the lymph node contains B cells, plasma cells, which are antibody-producing cells, so cells that are able to produce antibodies. These plasma cells are also cells that have migrated out of the cortex and into the medulla. And then we're also going to see macrophages. Now, lymph flows through a node in one direction only. Just like we see how lymph flows through the entire body in a single direction because of those valves, we also see single direction flow through a lymph node. So it will enter a lymph node through several afferent lymphatic vessels. So this is kind of going to be step one in the flow through a lymph node. So remember that afferent means to carry toward, and efferent means to carry away from. So these afferent lymphatic vessels penetrate that convex surface of the node at several different points. And these afferent vessels, these contain valves that open toward the center of the node. And so this is a specific way that we're going to be directing lymph inward toward the node. Now, within the node, there are these sinuses that lymph will enter into. Now, sinuses, these are a series of irregular channels that contain branching reticular fibers. There's also going to be lymphocytes and macrophages within these sinuses. So from the afferent lymphatic vessels, the lymph flows into subcapsular sinuses. So we can see these actually right here. This is going to be kind of our second location of flow of lymph through the lymph node. These subcapsular sinuses are found directly beneath the capsule. From here, the lymph flows through trabecular sinuses. Third step of flow through the node. And these trabecular sinuses extend through the cortex parallel to the trabeculae. You can see here, kind of run alongside the trabeculae. Then the trabecular sinuses will flow into medullary sinuses, which extend through the medulla. Now the medullary sinuses will drain into usually one or two efferent lymphatic vessels, which are wider and also fewer in number than the afferent lymphatic vessels. So this will be kind of our fifth and final step of lymph flow through the lymph node. Now, efferent lymphatic vessels contain valves that open away from the center of the lymph node, and this is to convey lymph and antibodies secreted by plasma cells and activated T cells out of the node. Efferent lymphatic vessels emerge from one side of the lymph node at this kind of a slight depression here, which is called the hilum. Oops. Blood vessels will also enter and leave the node at the hilum. Now, lymph nodes really kind of act or function as a type of filter. So as lymph enters one side of a lymph node, the foreign substances are trapped by the reticular fibers within the sinuses of the node. So the reticular fibers within the sinuses will trap these foreign substances. The macrophages will destroy some of these substances by phagocytosis, while lymphocytes will destroy other foreign substances by immune responses. So remember those lymphocytes, those B cells and T cells. The oval spleen is the largest single mass of lymphatic tissue in the body. It's located in the left hypochondriac region between the stomach and the diaphragm. Now there's a capsule of dense connective tissue that surrounds the spleen, and it's covered in turn by a serous membrane, the visceral peritoneum. Trabeculae, these extend inward from the capsule. And the capsule plus trabeculae plus the trabecular fibers and fibroblasts constitute the stroma of the spleen. The parenchyma which is the functional part of the spleen, this consists of two different kinds of tissue. These are white pulp and red pulp. Now, white pulp, this is a lymphatic tissue consisting mostly of lymphocytes and macrophages. And they're arranged around these branches of the splenic artery, which are called central arteries. So white pulp is arranged around central arteries. Now red pulp, this consists of these blood-filled venous sinuses and cords of splenic tissue, which are called splenic cords. Now, splenic cords, these consist of red blood cells, macrophages, lymphocytes, plasma cells, and granulocytes. The splenic veins are going to be very closely associated with the red pulp. Now, within the red pulp, the spleen performs three functions related to blood cells. So our first function is the removal of ruptured, worn out, or defective blood cells and platelets. And this is completed by the macrophages in the red pulp. So just put removal of dead and dying blood cells, but this remembers those ruptured or worn out cells or even defective blood cells. Blood cells and also platelets too. So these are all going to be removed by the macrophages, these blood cells and platelets that are defective or dead or dying. Our second function is going to be the storage of platelets. Even up to a third of the body's entire supply of platelets is stored within the spleen, within that red pulp. And then our third function is the production of blood cells. This is mainly during fetal life. So hemopoiesis during fetal life. So remember, hemopoiesis is that production of blood cells. So lastly, very briefly, I'll talk about lymphatic nodules. These are also called lymphatic follicles. These are going to be egg-shaped masses of lymphatic tissue that are not surrounded by a capsule. Now, because they're scattered throughout the lamina propria of mucous membranes, or that connective tissue around mucous membranes, lining the gastrointestinal, reproductive, urinary, and respiratory tracts, lymphatic nodules in these areas are also referred to as mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT. Although many lymphatic nodules are going to be small and kind of solitary, they're going to be separated from other lymphatic nodules. Some lymphatic nodules occur in multiple large aggregates in specific parts of the body. Among these are going to be the tonsils. The tonsils in the pharyngeal region, these are going to be a large aggregate of MALT tissue. And that will be the end of chapter 20.